Welcome to the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, the podcast where the certain things in life are not as certain as you may think. This is our first episode of the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, and we're really privileged to welcome here today with us in the studio, Conscious Caracal.
So, Conscious Caracal, I have a question. Obviously, we've now moved into a podcast where we are hosting in English, and the reason for that, I think, is because we are realizing that South Africa is becoming more and more international news. We see that recently the president received a letter from 5 large nation states, basically telling him to pick up some slack and to get his room in order. Do you think South Africa will become more of a player in international media and in the international economy in the next couple of years?
I honestly don't think so. I think we are, to be completely honest, I think we are just the flavor of the month in world politics. As soon as the country is no longer that interesting to Americans or to Europeans in terms of, for example, they're looking at South Africa expecting us to become the next Zimbabwe, so they're obviously grabbing their popcorn and tuning into anyone reporting from the ground. But I honestly think it's not something that's going to be long term. If you want to start a podcast, you're going to have to create an audience in your domestic country. Your fame is not going to last that long in the international country, in the international world. I think, yes, South Africa will always be an interesting place. We are a pretty strange, absurd country, quite an anomaly in the world. But I don't think there's anything that makes us so much different that will make us stand out on the podcasting scene in the world, where people will say, I really want a South African opinion on this issue.
So looking at, for instance, the Joe Rogan show that recently mentioned South Africa and spoke about farm murders. Well, not recently. I mean, that was last year, even a couple months back into last year. You don't think, in other words, that's going to be the norm for a couple of years? It's going to be maybe only here and there sparks of that happening?
I'm taking human nature into account, and we're pretty easily bored. So what usually happens is humans get burned out with certain topics and certain crises or certain dramas. So I don't think we will be able to really captivate the world for that long if something new doesn't happen or something new doesn't come up, something new and interesting that really grips them. For example, I don't think the world is that, and it might be a bit cynical, but I don't think the world is that interested in farm murders in the long term. I think now, because it's been thrust onto the world scene, a lot of people are tuning in and they're curious. But I think just being human nature, I think after a few years, they're going to move on to the next thing that is going to outrage them or shock them. They almost become not complacent. They become desensitized to it.
Yeah, used to it, essentially.
Yeah. So my question particularly pertaining to farm murders, for example, it's an issue that has gained a lot of international media attention recently, and we all know, like Paul mentioned, it started through Dani Barnard and the Joe Rogan podcast, and then eventually Donald Trump tweeted about it. But to a very large extent, it's limited to one side of, I want to say, the media bias spectrum, if you can call it that. I mean, it's only a certain part of the media that reports on farm murders, that reports on expropriation without compensation. And perhaps that's also another danger or, struggle for alternative media in South Africa trying to make it internationally. The point is that just a certain part of the international media actually looks at what's happening in South Africa. So it's already niche, and now it's even more niche because there's a certain political flavor to it.
Well, firstly, to explain that phenomenon of only one side really reporting on one issue, it's not because it's a battle between good and evil, because one side is inherently concerned about people and the other side is demonic. It's absolutely not that. It's because we've entered a time in politics where people believe that if you support one type of issue, that type of issue is kind of monopolized by one side. So if you start caring about, let's say, for example, if you're on the right and you start caring about pro-choice, then a lot of people see that as you giving in to some of your opponent's demands, because politics has become so polarized. Therefore, a lot of media outlets and a lot of people on the left and right have become completely averse to giving any leeway to their opponents or to the other side, because they see it as a loss and they see it as a victory for their opponents. And that's not how politics should be. If the economy is doing well under a leftist or a right-wing president, you should celebrate it. It's not something that it's happening in America right now, where the American economy just now they've published more statistics showing that the economy is actually doing quite well in terms of job creation and growth. Yeah. But you can see from the American Democrats, they're not very chuffed about it. They're not celebrating it. They're actually trying to downplay it as much as they can, which shows me that politics has moved away from that position where there's compromise and a common goal or a common thing to be celebrated, and rather it's just turned into a polarized competition. What was your second question?
The fact that so obviously it's polarized, and then secondly it's difficult to make the news when the news is very specifically focused internationally.
Right. So what's going to probably happen, this is my prediction, is that, like I said earlier, I don't think the average international person cares specifically about a South African's opinion on anything other than South African issues. So if no new dramas or crises or anything pops up in South Africa, I don't think we're going to be that special on the world stage. Why would they listen to a South African's opinion on, let's say, a coming civil war in Venezuela when they can just listen to a Venezuelan podcaster? So I think that's why I'm calling us the flavor of the month at the moment, because we are making the news almost on a weekly basis, seeing as our politics is moving at the speed of light. But at the same time, that's not going to last. There's going to come a time when our little 15 minutes of fame are going to be done. And then I don't think there's going to be anything distinguishing a South African podcast from an American one, except if you're really good at what you're doing.
Yeah. So just to turn the conversation to another point, our friends at the Rational Standard always say that the Rational Standard was born out of the Fees Must Fall movement and the Roads Must Fall movement, and that it was sort of a reaction to what was happening on our campuses. When you started podcasting and when you started your alternative media platform, would you say there was a single event that kind of spurred on your movement, your conversation, or do you think it was more just you wanted to start doing something and it just happened?
Yeah, well, I think it's more of in the latter camp, in terms of I didn't really plan any of this. It started off as, I think it was the Orlando terrorist attack, one of these big high-profile terrorist attacks, and I went on social media to get information on it. And all I saw were just people apologizing, saying things like, oh, but the Crusades and the IRA are also a Christian terrorist organization. And I was actually shocked at the amount of misinformation going around and apologetics going around, not addressing the actual issue at hand of how the person was radicalized. So then I said, okay, I'm going to do my own research. And I went and got all the stats, did all the research, made a video, put it all together so that if someone is looking, so I titled it Christian versus Islamic Terrorism, with like a KKK guy on the one side and this terrorist on the other side. And then I uploaded it just so it's there. So when people want to go compare the two, all the information is there with a well-sourced description. And I actually just made my Twitter account to promote that video. And then I kind of just started using my Twitter account to put my opinions out there with the exact same sentiment of nobody's approaching this problem from this angle. I might as well put this angle out there. And then I started getting traction, and then the American election hit. But not the election itself, just the campaigning phase. And, well, firstly, I didn't even know Trump had a chance. But then some little voice told me there's maybe the corporate media is not giving me the full picture. So I just followed a bunch of regular Americans, just normal people on the ground. And then I got a completely different picture. And then I was able to predict that Donald Trump would win. And then a lot of those people followed me back, and they wanted me to give a South African opinion about what's happening in America. But then also they wanted to know what's happening in my country. So I started talking about that, and I started doing well. And I started networking with other social media individuals, and it just grew from there, basically.
So if we're looking at alternative media in South Africa, obviously it's a new thing, it's a niche thing. Do you think it's going to become mainstream? I mean, obviously you've got a great success story of how you went mainstream, and I think that could be a good example to a lot of people. Simply by speaking the truth, you got a lot of traction, because I think essentially if you're going to spread lies, you're not going to get a lot of traction. So for you to have 4 or 5 years of good traction means that you're putting facts out there. But in South Africa, we see that even when you are giving out facts, even when you are spreading honest news and bringing honest opinions. It seems almost as if we're not there yet with alternative media, whether that be because people simply don't have the means to access it, or because people aren't that interested in news, or whatever the case may be. Do you see the future for us being more alternative in terms of media?
I'm going to give you a bit of a meta answer. I think the alternative media is successful because it is the alternative. I don't think the alternative media, once it becomes the mainstream, it's going to lose all its charm. It's going to lose all its appeal, and it's just going to become that boring, sterile corporate product that the mainstream media is. A good example is one of my favorite YouTubers, Styx Hexenhammer, who analyzes the news. And he, in his appearance and his aesthetic and the way he does his show, is the complete exact opposite or negative of the mainstream media. So where a mainstream media outlet would have some guy in his 60s reading off a teleprompter with like a nice tie and well-cut hair, gray hair, and very sterile, very corporate, he is the complete opposite. He's sitting there with just a leather jacket on, long hair, fucking can swear all he wants, doesn't have any guidelines or things that keep him in place. He can say exactly what he wants, and he is completely honest. He's not reading off a teleprompter. He specifically does all his videos in one take. So it's the complete inverse of the mainstream media, and that's why he gets all the appeal, is the fact that he is not the main. People don't. That's why. Just look at all the layoffs that are happening in America right now.
Thank goodness.
Thousands of journalists being laid off. It's a threat to our democracy. No, I think it's very healthy for democracy if you can cut down on that bloated industry that's reporting on quizzes about what type of potato are you, or things like that. I don't think that's really a threat to democracy if that journalist is laid off. So to finish my thought, the idea of look at the mainstream media. They're laying off people. They are streamlining. They are trying to adapt to the new environment. The alternative media is not doing that. The only thing holding back the alternative media is a lack of funds. Otherwise, the alternative media is growing in every aspect, while the mainstream media is cutting down on its size and its capacity. And I think that should tell you all you need to know.
If I may follow up briefly, I hear what you're saying in terms of the alternative media is successful because it's the alternative, and I think that's a fresh thought and something that I haven't really put into perspective. But I do have a question. If we look at, for instance, the Ben Shapiro show, now, right, that might be a black swan, and we shouldn't see that as the norm. But essentially, I think he was the 6th most listened to program in the US last year, not even looking only at podcasts. So if that was to be an indication, then haven't we already gotten to a stage where alternative media has become mainstream media? How many journalists lost their jobs as a direct, with Ben Shapiro as a direct reason? I think it must be more than one at least.
Yeah, well, my reply there would be that I don't see the Ben Shapiro show as alternative media. It's more of missing link media, the middle point, where they have a lot of corporate elements, but they are still a little bit alternative as well. So I would say the fact that they have that scale that they do makes them more of a missing link media, and that's why you'll see a lot of similarities between them and the mainstream. The alternative media, I think there's upward mobility. I think alternative media individuals can become mainstream, and mainstream journalists maybe not as easily, but they can also join the alternative media. Like, for example, a lot of these investigative journalists now are breaking away from mainstream outlets and starting their own YouTube channel, starting their own blogs and whatever, and not tying themselves to some corporation. So I think there's upward and downward mobility between both. And if you look at shows like the Ben Shapiro show, I think those are more the middle point, the missing link, where you get elements of both, and therefore you get more success and more capacity as well.
So how would you define alternative media then in that sense?
Alternative media is basically the counterculture taking on the news industry in terms of firstly, I think alternative media is characterized by the fact that they're not some corporation. They're not owned by some other big company. Secondly, they don't have they're basically, what alternative media is what the mainstream media is not. So without the mainstream media, alternative media would not really you wouldn't be able to conceptualize it, because it wouldn't have something to contrast it to. So my argument would be that alternative media is firstly based, or the definition would be based on its scale, on its approach to media, on the fact that it's not captured, if you will, by a bunch of advertisers or political interests or lobbyists or whatever, like a lot of these channels are. They are from the ground up, they are grassroots in terms of some guy sitting in his room talking to his camera, or some girl sitting in a little studio she put together herself with no actual support from another big company. So I do think it's a bit of a vague conceptualization, but alternative media is defined by what it is not, rather than by what it is.
Yes, I understand. So my last question, just on alternative media, that we've recently been talking quite a lot about. I mean, it's all over the news, fake news, and like I said, misinformation or whatever. And how do you see alternative media fitting into that whole? Let's almost call it a void. I mean, the point is, as many issues that the mainstream media has, is they, at least 15 years ago, sort of fact-checked, and they had editorial boards which were decent. I mean, now they don't. I mean, I think we can all agree that mainstream media is really... They commit a lot of fake news, and they publish a lot of fake news. How do you see alternative media fitting into that?
Well, I think I'll give you my angle on why I think the mainstream media has opted to become more tabloid-like almost. It's a symptom of a dying industry in terms of, firstly, they can't compete with some guy giving the news on his webcam, because they have to, firstly, when they're doing all that fact-checking, that takes time, that takes effort, that takes resources. So they can't just break a story. They have to firstly see, okay, what are the facts? That's how it used to work. But now with the internet becoming a thing, now some guy with a webcam can just break the story hours before the mainstream media, even though they have it already in their possession, because he is not held down by all that admin and regulations and fact-checking. So he could have it completely wrong, but he's breaking the story. The New York Times is no longer breaking the story. So therefore, they started cutting corners. They started streamlining their process. They need to break it faster because they need to compete with this younger, faster guy next to them. But they can't. They still can't. So now they've gotten to a point where they've cut so many corners, they are just rushing out news stories just to compete. And obviously, to no avail. It's not working. It's helping. It's a little bit better than their old model, but it's still destroying them. And therefore, you get a lot of fake news as well, as they're becoming more tabloidized, or becoming more like tabloids, because they just can't compete. Firstly, and then it's twofold as well. They're losing a lot of their audience. So to gain back some of their audience and get clicks in the internet era, they have to start sensationalizing. They have to start creating clickbait headlines. They can't just report a story as it is anymore. They have to give a headline that will shock people, that will, this is the next bombshell. Trump is going to be impeached now. This is like the 5th time Russian collusion will be proven. This time we've got him. And then nothing. That's why I always use with the mainstream media, or any type of story that is too good to be true. Any type of story that completely shatters the world, I give it 48 hours, the 48-hour rule of just give it a little bit of time before it falls apart. Because that's the nature of news. They won't, the chances of a story that completely changes the world or turns the world on its head are so slim that when that story comes along, you always have to give it the benefit of the doubt. Well, you have to always doubt it first and wait. And if that story still holds up 48 hours later, then you can start saying, okay, this is big if true.
So in one of his books, Malcolm Gladwell writes about the idea of bombs during the Second World War in London. I think it was the Outliers. I'm not exactly sure. And then what he says is in the countryside, English children were petrified and terrified because the Germans are going to bomb us or whatever. But in London, having heard bombs every single day, the kids were just literally waiting until the planes were over, and then they went back onto the football field and played and kicked a ball around. Now, what happened there was desensitization, and people were sort of realizing, listen, it isn't that big a terror because we're constantly hearing these planes, and essentially either they really aim badly or whatever the reason is, but we're fine. Aren't we getting to a point where things that should have shocked us are sort of becoming normal? What I'm saying is, if you read in the newspaper even 10 years ago, some of the things that Angelo Agrite has been saying, or and people aren't even reacting. People are like, oh, okay, that's fine. Well, probably tomorrow we'll hear some more facts. I'm not going to really react to this. I'll wait until something really big happens. But 10 years ago, this would have been big. I mean, we were a country that was shocked by Hansie Cronje taking a cell phone and sending SMSs, and now it's just like, oh, R500,000 for campaign votes. Oh, that's 300,000 a month. Okay, we're not even talking about it. It's not even a thing. Aren't we becoming desensitized to a point where it's dangerous, where we should have actually cared, where we should have actually done something? What's your take on that?
No, definitely. I can't exactly tell you why that's happening. The desensitization, well, in a very broad sense, I know why it's happening. It's just overexposure. But at the same time, it disappoints me to some degree that South Africans are becoming so desensitized to things that they should be outraged about, no matter how much they hear about them. Like, for example, farm murders. Me personally, I will always be shocked by a story where some small child is tortured to death. That's not something that I can become desensitized to. I don't think so. So, yeah, but at the same time, so I can't tell you where this desensitization is coming from psychologically. But I can tell you that it's only going to get worse in terms of because it's going to create this weird synthesis with the mainstream media also becoming more sensationalist and tabloid. Because you have to understand the South African media idolizes the American media and the British media. So as the American and British media start making the mistakes that they are, and as they start becoming more sensationalist because they're dying, the South African media will start copying them and start doing the exact same thing, as we already see. So my prediction will be, and it's a bit off tangent, and then I'll get back to your question. In a few months, maybe a little longer, in about half a year, we're going to start seeing huge layoffs in the South African media as well. We always follow the same trends as the American and British media, but with a pretty strong lag. So because we have a smaller scale. So you're going to start, that'll be my prediction. We're going to be hit with some major South African media layoffs in the coming months. But then also to get back to your question, just to answer that fully, I think that synthesis is going to happen where the South African media's increasing sensationalism is just going to contribute to more desensitization, where there's going to come a point where the media can't sensationalize a story anymore, where they've already played the entire hand. They've already said this is the biggest corruption scandal South Africa has ever seen for the 5th time in a row. So there's going to come a point where people are just going to be like, okay, I can't see how it can get any bigger unless like Cyril Ramaphosa makes himself the head of the South African Reserve Bank and just prints himself a bunch of money. Mm-hmm. But so I do think the desensitization is going to become much worse, and then it's going to get better. Because then people are going to get to a point where they're going to completely just reject the sensationalist media and start looking at the world as it is, and then they're going to become more human to an extent. Less media consumers and more just people looking at what's going on around them and reacting to it in a natural, not a grassroots way, in a natural, non-artificial way. Yeah.
So just onto a next point of conversation. 2019, it's an election year, and we know the silly season is in full swing. What are your predictions for the polls? What's going to happen in May 2019?
Yeah, no, I thought you were going to ask me the more difficult question in terms of who should people vote for.
No, we won't put you on the spot.
Yeah, yet. Okay. So my prediction will be, and it's still the same as it was a few months ago when I was on, whose podcast was it? Doesn't matter. My prediction is what's going to happen. Firstly, the DA is, it's going to depend. Let's start with the DA. It's going to depend on two things. Firstly, can it gain more African or black votes than it is going to lose from minority groups due to its switch in strategy in terms of its campaigning switch, which we're all aware of, basically. If you don't realize what they're doing or seeing how they are maneuvering themselves, looking at, for example, Ngwenya leaving, if that doesn't tell you something about the direction that the DA is going in, or if you look at Schweizer Reinicke, or if you're looking at Ashwin's whole scandal, if you don't look at these things and take those into account, and you don't see the very blatant directional shift that the DA has gone through, then you're not paying attention. So the DA's results are going to depend on how successful that policy, or not policy, but rather their campaign shift is compared to the amount of people that they're going to lose with this juggling act. So I'm not going to go on paper saying confirmed I know what is going to happen with them, but I do know that it's either going to be they're going to stay stagnant or they're going to lose about 2 to 4%. But I'm leaning more towards stagnation, where they're just going to hover around 20, 22%. EFF definitely going to grow. I think they're going to be the stars of the election. I think they're going to be the party that does the best, because they are currently the most successful party in terms of just proportionally growth and campaigning and getting into the news. Good publicity and bad publicity, but any type of publicity is good if you listen to Trump and if you see how it worked for him. So I think the big stars of this election are going to be the EFF. They're going to definitely grow. I'll put my money on that. I'll put it on paper. They're not going to stagnate or shrink. ANC, I think, are going to not make 60%, but they're also not going to have a disaster of an election. Might get 57, 58 or around there, but I think the election for them is going to be characterized, well, that's what the media is going to latch on to, and the opposition, of course, the fact that they're not going to make 60%. And then the smaller parties, COPE might make 3% if they're lucky. VF Plus, I don't know. Well, I always joke that the VF Plus only wake up during an election year, and then other years they go back into hibernation. So this year now they're taking what's aankla? Soos hulle kla nou met klomp mense aan.
They're accusing and prosecuting.
Ja. Nee, hulle prosecute nie die mense. Hulle kla hulle aan by die menseregte.
Laying complaints.
Ja. So you can uitsny tot daar. So what they're doing is for example, this year now they taking a lot of people to the South African Human Rights Court, and they are actually doing things. Well, they're not fixing potholes like AfriForum, for example, but at least they're coming into the private and to the public eye again. But I don't think they've done enough. I think they should have started their campaigning at least 2 years ago, where they just start doing small things like fixing potholes and helping people with their legal fees and whatever. But yeah, so that's my prediction for 2019. What are your predictions for 2019?
Well, I think you actually summarize it quite well. I think I think the DA will grow with 1% or 2%. I think that's the only place where I perhaps differ, because of that change in strategy. I think that they might see a little success, and what my fear is that because of that little success, they latch onto it, and then they think, okay, well, this is the direction to go into, just because of that minute difference in support that they might see. So that's my view on the DA. I think the EFF will grow, definitely. I think the whole issue on land will just further give them, a momentum going into the election. And then I don't think that COPE will do as well as a lot of people think they will. I think a lot of people are hopeful. I think with AfriForum and COPE, going into an informal, almost pact or whatever, I think a lot of people were like, yes, the COPE all the way, and this is the solution, because they like what Lekota is saying about expropriation, and they like what he's saying about nation unity, and it's understandable. I mean, I completely understand why people will latch onto a person saying everything will be okay and South Africa together is fine. I mean, we're all just people, and people cling onto that hope, but I just don't think the hope will in the end turn into COPE. And then on the Freedom Front Plus, I just don't think that they're super relevant, in the sense that I don't think they just have the support, which is sad, because I think on paper a lot of people will actually agree with the Freedom Front Plus. I think a lot of people will like their manifesto, or at least in theory. I think the problem is the Freedom Front Plus has some baggage that they need to deal with, political baggage, and political baggage is a difficult thing to in the end sort out. And then well, obviously the ANC is the next big question. I agree with you. I think they'll dip just below 60%. But I think they will be quite frightened by what's going to happen in 2019. And my worry, again, and this is perhaps the pessimist in me, is that because the ANC is frightened, they rush to centralize more power and to tighten their grip on South Africa. And the point is, it's not that far-fetched to think that the ANC will try to solidify its state power. I mean, they've been doing it for the past 25 years. So I really hope the ANC gets a big enough blow in these elections that they're not able to do that. That the transformation agenda and the tightening of the grip agenda can somehow be stopped.
So for me, I think that there's something. I think there's something very important that we might be forgetting, and I think many people are looking at 2014, looking at 2016, and saying, well, there's a downward curve from the ANC, and that's going to continue. What people forget is that the ANC's election machine only wakes up every 5 years. They don't have the amount of buses rushing to voting stations in provincial elections or municipal elections that they do with national elections. The ANC election machine will show all its teeth. And I think that will have an impact. What the size of that impact is, I don't know. What will happen in KZN, I think, will be very determining in terms of where the ANC is going to lie in the end. But I do agree with the main lines, and I think if everyone is saying the same things, then there should be a reason for that. So many people saying that the ANC will be somewhere between 57 and 59. Many people saying the DA won't really have massive movement either side. EFF will have some growth. Obviously, that depends on what we see in the next couple of months and what happens in the news and so on. And I have an interesting idea that I think the Freedom Front Plus might gain some points. Not a lot, but I think many, especially Afrikaans people who are very loyal voters, have just had enough of the DA. And they don't really have an alternative. They don't necessarily associate with COPE. And that could lead to some growth, but not something that you're going to write home about. Yeah, I think that's essentially what I'm thinking right now. Most people are saying ANC 57 to 59. I think we can talk about the rest and whatever that impacts, but that's going to be the main determining factor for the next 5 years in South Africa. So Cyril Ramaphosa with not a constitutional majority, but with a massive electoral majority.
Mm. So just to get onto a last point of conversation to wrap this episode up. I think we touched on alternative media, and now we've talked a bit about the election. But for both these things, for alternative media and the election, social media is super important. And Constance Caracal, I mean, you're quite a fundi on social media. I mean, you're quite popular and you do quite well. What are the dangers for social media, and specifically, what are the dangers for alternative media users using social media? Because I think we've heard a lot about, shadow bans and about the algorithms really messing up these people's social media. How real is that? If you can just tell the listeners about that.
Yeah, well, I'll answer you by just one statement. And why do you think the mainstream media is so censorship happy on social media? Because the people getting censored are their competitors, not them. Look at YouTube, for example. So there used to be a time when YouTube was about the U in the name. Now it barely can call itself that with any self-respect. YouTube, the site was built by regular people just making videos without any financial help, with any corporate backing, nothing. Just sitting there with a little webcam in their house and making a video. And the terms of service weren't as strict back then as well, so you could make videos on anything. You could talk about any topic you wanted, and YouTube wouldn't do anything to you. Nowadays, and you would get promoted on the front page if you were popular enough. Nowadays, front page is full with celebrities, mainstream media outlets, and some hand-picked YouTubers that are family-friendly and that are good brands. Not the type of content that I would want to see there. The type of people that are doing podcasts, people that are doing something without any financial backing. The guys that are making incredible content, doesn't even have to be political content, incredible content out of their own, with their own talent and their own little pool of money. No support, no advertisers or anything. But at the same time, the mainstream media is trying to transition onto social media and onto the internet because they've been caught off guard, basically. And if they aren't able to do that, they will go extinct. Well, not extinct, they'll go to the way of radio. But at the same time, that's why they're also supporting all this censorship, because the more censorship there is, the more room they will have to fill on the internet. Because the only people getting censored are the little people, the alternative media personalities, where you had with this Covington scandal in America now recently, where those boys were attacked by the mainstream media and by leftist politicians for wearing a MAGA cap. You had now there's this hashtag on Twitter called hashtag verified hate, where people just highlight all these people with blue check marks and how they abuse their platform to go after people and nothing is done to them. They're this almost elite class of Twitter. And what happened during this scandal now is a lot of people with blue check marks blatantly broke the terms of service of Twitter, where they sent harassment campaigns after these children and said, I want their details and I want to send fucking people to their house and shit. And it was shocking, but Twitter did nothing. And then these media layoffs happened. And then this meme started where just regular people started telling them to learn to code. Because during Obama's campaign, a lot of coal miners were laid off. And then Obama very coldly told them just to learn to code. So then when all these journalists, journalists started getting laid off, the public had their revenge and said, well, you just need to learn to code. And then a lot of these people that said learn to code got banned. So it just shows there's definitely a bias. There's definitely the social media sites are actually climbing into bed with the mainstream media, and it's not going to be to their benefit. It's only going to be to these social media sites' detriment. That's why they're all in decline almost. That's why Facebook stock is falling as it is. That's why Twitter stock is stagnant as it is. Because it isn't supporting the types of people that built those sites, that made them popular. Like, for example, like I said, the U in YouTube is no longer there.
Well, it touches on the subject of are these social media platforms, are they publishers or are they platforms? And the point is, if they exercise an editorial discretion, if they decide what gets published or what gets showed or how effective is the broadcasting of these things, then they do get to the publisher side. And then the point is, then they are supposed to be scrutinized differently. I mean, if I'm just a platform, it's the same analogy. If I have a notice board and my notice board is free for anybody to use to just go stick up whatever nonsense they want to stick up there, then I just gave a platform for people to use the notice board. But as soon as I start deciding what gets put onto the notice board, then there's a different responsibility on my shoulders. And then obviously you're going to be treated differently. And I think it was famously said last year that Facebook publicly says that it's a platform, but in court papers, when they get sued for defamation or whatever, then they say no, but they're a publisher and they have this editorial discretion, and it's frightening. I mean, the point is, there are alternatives. I mean, there's an alternative to Twitter, there are alternatives to Facebook and whatever, but Facebook, Twitter, YouTube have a complete monopoly over the use of information, the spreading of information, and it's quite dangerous. Just like how I feel about centralization of power in any other place, it's the same. It's the same with social media platforms.
Yeah. So essentially, I think where we're going is going to be interesting. And as this monster wakes up in South Africa, which you're obviously a part of, that's going to be a very interesting growth. And hopefully we get more people onto the idea of alternative media. I mean, why do you have to listen to a radio station that determines it's now 8 o'clock, now you're allowed to listen to the news? I mean, if you want to listen to the news at 18 minutes to 3, why not do that? So I think we're going to get there. And that's going to be an interesting point of growth. And obviously good luck to you as well on your path. You've been doing the things. If we're going to stick to social media memes, and yeah, good luck with that. I mean, we're obviously watching you and we like your content, so I think that's great. Looking forward to the future.
Yeah. For the listeners that listen to Third Person Podcast and haven't started following Conscious Caracal, where can they find you? Where can they start listening to your content?
Well, they can find me on YouTube by just searching Conscious Caracal, and they can find me on Twitter at my username ConCaracal, ConCaracal.
Roy cut in Afrikaans is way easier to spell, can I just say?
Much easier. But then they can also, or they can just search Conscious Caracal on Twitter and they can go find me there. But I don't think it's, a lot of people don't know who I am at this point in the alternative mediaverse.
Definitely.
I think there's people that dislike me and people that like me and people that are just apathetic. But but thank you for having me on, and I'm definitely looking forward to coming on again, if you guys will let me. And you're also welcome on my show quite soon once I've gotten my new rig set up.
Awesome. We're looking forward to it.
And for to you as listener, be sure to subscribe to the Death, Taxes and Change podcast wherever you get your dose of podcasts each week. Leave us a review on iTunes and Castbox. It really helps us in the rankings. And then thank you very much for tuning in. The Death, Taxes and Change podcast is proudly brought to you by Podmedia.